Hi, this is Wendy Lightheart, and in this lesson we are going to look at the multiplication and division of real numbers. First, let's look at the product of two real numbers. To find the product of two real numbers, we multiply their absolute values, and then, if the two numbers have the same sign, then the product is positive. If the two numbers have opposite signs, then the product is negative. Let's look at some examples. This first example, we have a positive 9 times a positive 5. Those both have the same sign, so the product is positive. And their absolute values multiplied together gives us 45. In this next example, we have negative 2 times negative 3. Those are two numbers also with the same sign, so the product will be positive. And 2 times 3 is 6, so our answer is positive 6. In this next example, we have negative 7 times positive 4. Those have opposite signs. When we multiply two numbers with opposite signs, we get a negative product. 7 times 4 is 28, and because we're multiplying opposite signs, we get negative 28 as our product. This last example, we're multiplying 0 times negative 8. Now, it doesn't matter what sign the negative 8 is, because 0 times any number is 0. What if we're multiplying more than two numbers together? Well, assuming that no factor is 0, the product of an even number of negative numbers is going to be positive. Now, if you think about this, this should make sense. If you have an even number of negative numbers, that means you can pair up the numbers with two negative numbers together will make a positive, and the next two numbers multiplied together will make another positive, and you won't have any left over that are not paired up with another negative, so you end up with a positive times a positive times a positive, which will give you a positive. On the other hand, the product of an odd number of negative numbers will end up being negative. Because if you have an odd number of negative numbers, you can make pairs of negatives, and those will all be positives, but you'll always have one left over. And so you end up with a positive when you multiply all the pairs together. And then you multiply by that last negative that's left over, you end up with a negative product. The multiplication then is performed by multiplying the absolute values of all the given numbers, just as before. And of course, if any factor is 0, then the product will be 0. Let's look at some examples. For this next example, we're multiplying negative 3 times negative 5 times positive 2 times negative 7. So we have, first we multiply their absolute values together, we get 210, and then because we have an odd number of negative numbers, we have three negatives, then we know that the product is negative. So our answer is negative 210. See how that works? Now let's multiply negative 2 times negative 4 times positive 6 times negative 1 times negative 3. So we multiply their absolute values together first. 2 times 4 times 6 times 1 times 3 is 144. But what is the sign going to be? Well, we have an even number of negative numbers. We have 4 negatives multiplied together here. And so our product will be positive in that case, since that's an even number of negative numbers being multiplied. Now let's look at the quotient of two real numbers. That's when we're dividing. So the quotient of two real numbers with opposite signs is found by dividing their absolute values and then the quotient is negative. Notice how this is exactly the same as with the product of two real numbers with opposite signs. Similarly, the quotient of two real numbers with the same signs is found by dividing their absolute values, and then the quotient will be positive. And division of a non-zero number by 0 is undefined. So remember that. If you're dividing a non-zero number by the number 0, this will be undefined. On the other hand, if we have 0 divided by any non-zero number, then this result will be 0. So let's look at some examples. Here we want to divide negative 16 by positive 4. Notice that they have opposite signs, so we have a negative quotient, and 16 divided by 4 is 4. So our answer is negative 4. Now let's divide negative 12 by negative 15. Here we have the same signs, so we have a positive quotient. Now 12 cannot be divided evenly by 15, so what we would want to do here is to reduce that fraction to simplify. Now of course this can be done in one step, but just keep in mind that a negative divided by a negative will always be a positive, and then if you can't divide that evenly, make sure you just reduce that fraction. Now let's look at what happens when we have negative signs and parentheses together. If a negative sign precedes a set of parentheses, that means it comes right before a set of parentheses, then we remove the parentheses and we change the sign of every term within the parentheses. You can think of this as the same as distributing a negative 1. So for example, suppose we had a negative sign in front of negative 6x minus 5 inside parentheses. So if you think of it as distributing a negative 1, then negative 1 times negative 6x, that would be a negative times a negative, would give you a positive 6x. And same thing with the negative 1 times negative 5, a negative times a negative again becomes a positive, so we have a plus 5. Here we have another example, a negative sign in front of the parentheses, and remember this could be a subtraction sign. If we had something before that negative sign, then that would be considered a subtraction sign, but the rule is still the same. We distribute that negative sign, or think of it like distributing a negative 1, which will get rid of the parentheses and will change all the signs on all the terms within the parentheses. So the negative 5x becomes positive 5x, and the positive 3 becomes negative 3. So whichever way you want to think of it will work, because the signs will get changed and the parentheses will disappear. One more example here. We have negative outside the parentheses of 8x plus 7, and so that 8x will become negative 8x, and the plus 7 will become minus 7. Let's look at one last example putting all of this together. Let's simplify this expression. So notice that we have two sets of parentheses here. One set is preceded by the number 3, so we have 3 times 2x minus 5 in parentheses. And then we have a minus sign before the next set of parentheses. So we're going to have to distribute the 3 and distribute that minus sign, which remember you can think of as like distributing a negative 1. So when we distribute the 3, we have 3 times 2x, and then 3 times negative 5 will become a negative, so I just put a minus sign in front of that product, and then we have 3 times 5. Then when we distribute the negative sign or the minus sign in front of the 4x plus 7 inside parentheses, the 4x becomes negative and the 7 becomes negative. Next we will continue to multiply, so the 3 times 2x will give us 6x, and the 3 times 5 gives us 15. That just simplifies it up a little bit. Now I'm going to change the subtractions to addition. Now remember, you can do this mentally, but it's important that you do it this way before you actually rearrange terms and start combining like terms. So we end up with 6x plus negative 15 plus negative 4x plus negative 7. Now notice when we rearrange the terms and group like terms together, we'll end up with 6x minus 4x and negative 15 plus negative 7. Now we combine those like terms, so that will give us 2x, and then the negative 15 plus negative 7 gives us negative 22. Now this actually can be simplified a little more, because notice we have plus a negative 22. Whenever you see that, you want to simplify that, because that can be turned back into subtraction by changing the sign of 22 to positive. So we end up with 2x minus positive 22. And notice that has one less operation symbol, so that's considered more simplified. And that is it for our lesson today. Have fun!